So the problem area of interest that we decided to focus on was the stigma around video games. Is it real? If so, why is there a stigma? Hypothesis was there's video games that are deemed lesser because of the nerdy stereotype that is lined with them. So we thought that this stigma was from a social standpoint. This is why it is a lesser form of pop culture, and we set out to either prove or disprove that theory. With this theory in mind, we really wanted to attempt at closing the gap on the negative association within video games and find out why that would be the case in the first place. Again, this came from a social angle, is what we were targeting here. In this project, we dug deeper to find out why there's stigma behind video games, if there even is one, and how the stigma affects our daily perception. It was found that there was a decent amount of responders that thought video games were bad for you. They had negative effects, whether it be making people more violent or causing addiction issues. It was surprising to learn that a lot of the younger people were the ones citing this. It is important to note that majority found video games positive in their opinion, but still a large, decent portion, 35%, found video games having a negative effect. Now, some of these respondents suggested that studies show that video games make people more violent, or that there's a study that was debunked long ago and it still remains fresh and disrupts people's perception on video games. This feeds into the misinformation rather than the stigma. As we originally sought out looking for a stigma, it quickly started to dwindle into misinformation plaguing the public rather than a stigma on a social aspect of being nerdy. So this topic is important in terms of everyday life because it gives parents, for example, less of a worry about their children if they play video games. It is necessary to relieve the world of this misinformation, showing the truth about video games with the benefits and positives rather than grasping at straws trying to find the negatives. To the field of study, it is important to recognize that despite previous studies stating the negative effects of video games being debunked, there is still misinformation being spread about video games, and it is important to acknowledge this misinformation and focus on that rather than creating more studies debunking negative associations. Now, debunking is a form of attacking misinformation, yes, but people still cite these debunked studies today show not enough is being done. Now, the literature review key terms start with violence, media effects, desensitization, addiction, moral panic, stigma, and gaming disorder. The first on the list is the Bobo doll experiment. This study done in 1963 shows the effects media violence has on children. It, quote unquote, proves that there is a direct correlation between media violence and people committing violence. Although influential, this study has been disproven. Although no longer relevant, this study plays a large role in the criticism of video game violence, as it is one of the first studies connecting violence and media. The second is the motivating roles of violence in video games. 2009, this study consists of 2 surveys and 4 experiments which prove that violence in video game do not play a large role in their enjoyment. Other factors such as enjoyment and desire to win are the main factors which drive players. This study also discusses why people desire the virtual world. Next, we have the positive and negative effects of video games. This is a more recent documentation of the positive and negative views of video games. This chapter addresses the previous focus of violence and the negative effects of video games, as well as the more recent research debunking and supporting the benefits that video games have on their players. It also touches on video game addiction, the new focus of stigma attributed to video games. Following the positive and negative effects of video games, we have Much Ado About Nothing. This article shows that previous research regarding the negative effects of video games are biased and can easily be disproved. It cites many methodology flaws in the studies. This article serves as proof of past researchers' desire to paint video games in a negative light, therefore perpetuating the stigma surrounding video games. Exploring factors inhibiting the uptake of computer and video games. This article breaks down the hesitations regarding using video games as a mode for education. Although there has been research regarding the benefits of using video games as a tool for learning, there remains a stigma regarding the negative effects of video games. This article proves that video games are still viewed in a negative light by many. Continuing, we have Minecraft, a game as an education and scientific learning tool. This article breaks down the ways in which video games can be used as an educational tool. Minecraft is a popular video game which has created an educational version for school to teach math and science. Although praised for engaging in ways in which the game promotes education, very few schools have adapted the game into curriculum.
For our method, we chose to do an online survey. It featured a variety of questions, both multiple choice and long answer. We chose this option as it was a COVID-safe opportunity and could reach a wide audience of different ages and locations. The open-ended questions allowed us to understand why people answered certain questions in certain ways. We ended up getting a wide range of ages, however, the majority of participants were between the ages of 15 to 20. Our first question was, how often do you play video games? Our top 3 answers were never, once every few months, and every day. This variety allowed us to get varying opinions, which was very helpful for our discoveries. Our second question was, has the amount of hours you spend playing video games each day changed due to the pandemic? The following question asked, by how much did gameplay increase? The majority of participants said that their average gameplay increased by 3 to 5 hours during COVID-19. This question is relevant as it shows the impact that video games have had throughout the pandemic. Many participants also bring up the pandemic when talking about the benefits of video games later on in the survey. The next question asks whether the participants thought that video games have a positive or negative effect on their players. The majority of participants argued that video games have a positive effect on their players, however, 35.4% argued that it had a negative effect. The majority of those who said that video games had a negative effect were from the younger age demographic, which was something that we were not expecting. Following these questions, we asked participants to explain why they think video games either had a positive or negative effect. Some of the positive reasons include creating friendships, teamwork, an engaging form of media, coordination, as well as a COVID-safe activity and way to socialize with friends. Older participants often brought up learning new skills as a reason for video games having a positive effect. Those that said video games have a negative effect used reasons such as addiction, toxic environment, makes people lazy, overstimulation, violent video games create violent players, which will be discussed further, and a lack of socialization. We hypothesized that the majority of negative reviews come from people who play video games and who have had bad experiences. The next question asks, do you think there's a correlation between violent video games and violence in people? 51% of participants were unsure if there was a direct correlation between violent video games and violent people, so we asked them to explain their reasoning and why they may be unsure. We give answers of why people think that violence may be associated with violent video games and may not be. These include, it varies from person to person, some connection, but people weren't sure how strong, desensitization and normalization of violence, previous studies showing that there is a connection, as well as a negative impact on children, but not sure as to what effect it has on adults. Upon examining the data, we learned that there may not be a stigma towards video games, but instead a misinformation that results in people being untrusting and unsure of whether video games are safe and healthy. Many participants had an optimistic point of view on video games, citing the COVID-19 pandemic as a reason. It allowed children and adults to socialize with one another in a fun, interactive way while still maintaining a safe distance. After looking at the survey and analyzing the answers, I believe that the majority of negative views on video games comes from misinformation due to past research and campaigns to paint video games in a negative light. Previous campaigns were done for TV and movies, and video games is just a new area of media which is being targeted. Although opinions are more positive than in previous years, there's still an underlying uncertainty as to the effects video games have on people and their actions. As demonstrated throughout our presentation, there are many benefits to video games as well as an artistic value to the creation of video games itself. As the pandemic continues and gameplay continues to increase, I believe we will see a more positive view of video games, not only from the younger generation, but from the older generation as well. This area of study is very interesting and should be explored more, not only to improve the video game industry, but to implement video games in things such as education and workplaces. Video games provide a creative outlet not only for the creators, but the players. This survey has shown that there is an overall optimistic view of video games, and therefore they should be used more as a tool for education and other purposes, as well as be appreciated for its artistry.
So, what do these results mean? The results show that a majority of people actually do believe video games have a positive impact. It was a direct contradiction to what we previously thought, this social stigma behind video games. But for those who still do believe it has a negative effect, again, it wasn't the social stigma, and it was just more misinformation, whether it be them using anecdotal examples for why, or pointing towards studies that have already been debunked. So there was a lot of correlations with previous studies. You can see the pattern that even people who didn't necessarily think video games had a negative effect, because majority said they believe video games had a positive effect, they were still unsure if, for example, video games made people violent. So 51% believe they weren't sure if video games made people violent. And this is, again, direct correlation to that previous study between media and violence, and other studies between video games and violence in the real world being connected. And these studies are studies that have been debunked, but it's just not information out there. Our study is different than previous studies in the way that we went out to seek what is this stigma behind video games, if there is one, and of debunking things and looking at the benefits and positive video games, we went directly to the source to see why people thought this way. And although the majority of people surveyed said that video games had a positive effect, which was surprising enough, it still makes it hard for people to accept the advantages or positives of video games, and seeing that how many people said the negatives, or how many people said, oh, maybe video games do make people violent. They were still unsure despite those studies being debunked. So as stated in one of the studies, Minecraft, a game as education and science learning tool, the game is proven to have positive effects and teach kids, but still very little educational systems have adopted this game. And this is through the misinformation that plagues this form of pop culture. It's important to push positive information out into the public rather than consistently debunking or refuting the negative effects. Now, these results cannot guarantee a positive release of information that would change opinions of those who have been fed misinformation in the first place. Perhaps it's easier to believe what you had first heard, or that there's no way video games are positive, as a parent might think. It makes my kid lazy. It's hard to adopt these new narratives if you have always believed a certain thing. And that's why it's important to note that this study helps get into the mindset of people, rather than try and debunk things or change people's minds. It's to see, do people still think this way? We set out to find out why people thought this way. And again, it seems like these previous studies are still fresh within people's minds. To conclude, we went out to answer the question, why are video games seen as a lesser form of media? And that kind of turned into a hypothesis, believing that there would be this stigma behind the social aspect of video games. It was kind of a nerdy thing. And from that, we learned that majority of people actually did find the positives within video games. Now, the people that thought that video games were negative, or the ones that thought that violence in video games can translate to violence in reality, were possibly thinking about studies they heard a long time ago, or heard maybe recently, that have been debunked by scholarly sources that we have found. Our hypothesis wasn't near correct at all. We thought that video games were seen in a negative light and as a lesser form of media, but the majority of people who actually thought video games had a positive impact on us as human beings, as people, shows that there's no real stigma there at all. In terms of further research, it's important, now that we know that these citations that people are making, or these connections that people are making, are referred to debunked studies, it's important to look at how do we change that, right? Instead of just debunking these studies, because many of them have been debunked and the information is out there, but it has not reached the people. So it's important to now look at, why are people so attached to these ideas? Why do they stick to video games make people violent, or video games don't have any benefits for anybody? Why is that something that people latch on to? And that's something that's very important to figure out in terms of battling this misinformation that is spread about video games today. And although, again, majority of respondents did not think that video games had a negative effect, it is still important to target the people that did. And that concludes this video. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great summer, everybody.